Hey everybody, and welcome to episode 302 of the Ruby Rogues podcast. This week on our panel we have Brian Hogan.
Hello everyone.
Dave Kimura.
Hello.
I'm Charles Max Wood from devchat.tv. Quick shout out, the call for proposals for Ruby Remote Conf is open if you want to go and speak. So this week we had a recommendation from our very own Dave to talk about web security. So, Dave, I'm going to let you kind of give a little bit of an introduction here as far as where you're at and what you're up to, and and let us know where to start with this.
Yeah, so I think that it would be good to just kind of explore the different types of security issues that you could come across when developing. Because, I fall victim to this myself where I get a great idea for an application and I just start diving into it. And security almost becomes a afterthought, where security really needs to be a primary focus in the back of your head as you're developing. How could something be potentially exploited? So I think that that's one big part of it is during the actual development phase. But then also, once your application goes live, you have to worry about so many other different kinds of vulnerabilities, whether it's cross-site scripting or someone trying to hack your site, or you got a distributed denial of service attack. So I think, a great topic to discuss is just kind of what is security with web application development? What does it look like in different situations? Maybe some companies who have had some recent issues, because I think security also kind of comes into play on your status, your SLA, because I think if you have a vulnerability within your application, whether it's a actual employee who has done something malicious or unmalicious, but it's still posed a issue where you're not able to deliver the content or service that you have promised your clients. But then also have a look at different tools that we can use to mitigate such issues, or how we can design our applications to mitigate some of these issues.
So you talked about cross-site scripting, and you mentioned some of these other things. One of the things that comes to mind is like SQL injection and stuff like that. And I just, I can hear somebody saying this, and so I want you to address it. And I'm sure Brian has thoughts on this too. But doesn't Rails handle a lot of that for you? Hey everybody, this is Charles Max Wood. I just wanted to talk to you really briefly about JS Remote Conf. We just picked speakers. Things are looking really good, and we're really excited to cover a broad range of topics for JavaScript developers. So if you're looking to learn things about Node.js, about becoming a better developer, about deployment, about mobile development, and much more about JavaScript, then come check us out, jsremoteconf.com. You can also find it by going to devchat.tv/conferences and then picking the conference you want. We have last year's recordings there. We have this year's conference coming up, so make sure you get your ticket, and we'll see you there. Doesn't Rails handle a lot of that for you?
It does, and there are a lot of good conventions, but that doesn't mean that you can just write code in Rails and you're secure. There's a lot of things that you can do to introduce cross-site scripting, whether it's you wrote some code that's vulnerable, or you use a third-party library that's vulnerable. There's also the issue of, like SQL injection. If you follow the Rails standards on how to perform queries and stuff, then you are pretty much safe. But if you're not sanitizing your user inputs, then you do open up the risk of SQL injection, even though that Rails inherently, following good conventions, can mitigate a lot of those issues.
Well, there's a lot of questions that I have. I want to start because the last thing you said was sanitizing user input. So I wanted to get your thoughts on this. Where do you stand on sanitizing input from the users? Are you on the side of the argument that says we should sanitize the user input and only store in our database the sanitized version, or do you stand on we're going to take exactly what the user gives us, but we'll sanitize it when we display it, or when we bring it out, or when we work with it?
That's a tough question, and I think it really is going to depend on what the actual end user's goal is. So I usually lean more towards to sanitize the input on the display, even if there could be some questionable content that gets stored in the database. But again, it really depends on what the actual application is, what fields I'm storing, and something like that.
Long time ago, the reason I asked this question is, long time ago, one of the first managers I ever had, she had been doing COBOL and stuff like that for 40 some years, since the very beginning of the language. And one of the rules that she had on her team was that we don't, as software developers, as database administrators, we don't own the data. We're just holding it. So her hard and fast rule over the years was, whatever the user gives you, you store it. Doesn't matter if it's junk or bogus, you store it because it's their property. You may want to look at what caused that. If you sanitize it, you lose it. You'll never be able to never be able to recreate the thing without having to go to the user. So that was her argument. And when I was younger, I was always arguing, but it's easier if we just clean it up, when we bring it in. And I think over the years, I've sort of come around to her way of thinking. But that's always a question I love to ask other software developers when it comes to security, because if you forget, right, if something gets in the database, if you didn't filter it out, now you have to deal with it in multiple parts of your application. And if you forget, you may have left yourself open.
Yeah, I just want to chime in on this too, and then I kind of want to take us back to some basic concepts before we get too deep off into the weeds. But on this particular issue, see, I come in on the other side where it's like, look, sanitize it up front. And the reason is because I built the application to solve somebody's problem, but I have a responsibility to everybody who uses the website. And so in my situation, I'm just better off making sure that I disarm any bombs or triggers that are put in the first place. And on top of that, I am basically providing you a service on my own terms. In other words, those terms include payment, and they also include terms of use. And so I'm going to set up those terms of use, as much as I can so that they benefit you and provide you with what you're looking for. But at the same time, terms of use saying I can sanitize your content also makes it a whole lot easier on me rather than having to worry about, did I sanitize it here, and here on the outputs?
Yeah, it's sort of you're renting you're renting an apartment in this apartment complex, and in order for you to do that, there are some rules you got to follow. So that's a good solid approach, I think. Yep.
Yeah, we have the right to come in and do mosquito abatement or drop a roach bomb or whatever.
Yep.
So anyway, I want to go back because I think we're kind of getting into some of these specific attacks, and I think it'd be helpful to talk about in general what kinds of attacks people launch. I mean, some of them seem to be aimed more at infrastructure like DDoS, and some of them seem to be aimed more at data like SQL injection, but it seems like there are probably classifications of security vulnerabilities or openings that we leave. And I'd kind of like to talk about those in general so we can get an idea of what we're looking at, and then we can talk about how to mitigate them.
Yeah, sure. So, I think that in each step of the process, even up into the client usage of the software, there's different levels of security and different things that we need to be aware of. So during the application development, we really do need to keep an eye on our code vulnerability. And this also includes third-party plugins, whether it's a JavaScript library or a gem that you're using. I don't think I've ever used a gem or a JavaScript library that was completely bug-free or security with no issues. So I think that it's our responsibility, if we are going to add a gem into our library, that we do review the source code, even to some degree of looking back at issues that have been posted for that gem. If there's any open issues of security vulnerabilities, that it's kind of your due diligence to look at. And then also picking up a book or reading about best practices with performing queries or writing code, I think is also a great part of security, simply because you're going to have some lines of code that are just absolutely known vulnerable because you're not sanitizing user input or you're opening up some other security issues. And I think that overriding, we need to take caution when overriding certain kind of conventions that Rails has already set in the configuration. I think Rails 5 by default started introducing the force SSL. Each form has its own authenticity token.
Mm-hmm.
And the cross-site forgery that's automatically baked into Rails. There are certain cases where you do want to override those, but you have to be careful to not make a blanket across your entire application to disable that security feature, because then you do open yourself up for risks. And then when we get to the client side of things, clients putting in JavaScript, for cross-site scripting that could affect or impact other users just based on what they're doing. And then you have the internet at large, bots or other things that could inadvertently create too much traffic on your website. So, each step in the development process and even into production, we always had to keep security in mind.
So even if you're starting out some dumb little project that you think nobody's ever going to use, nobody's ever going to touch, it's just kind of a sample project, and you're sort of just learning about Rails 5 because you've been doing Rails 4 for years and years, you should be paying attention to security on that thing?
Always. Now, if it's going to be internet facing, then I think that you should do your due diligence and make sure that it's secure. Because, part of it is we assume that, this application, it's no big deal. It does not have any sensitive data. But what we don't realize is that hackers out there, they're really smart. They're a lot smarter than me. And they're able to take even minute data and turn that into something that they can use to exploit someone, whether it's hack into someone's email or even do like a one of those little phone Nigerian scams or something.
Yeah. Yeah, it's not just about the data you're securing; it's about the application being used for other stuff, right? I mean, if a user can post stuff publicly, if they can use your application and post something that then shows up on a publicly accessible web page, it can be used for everything from dropping passwords or dropping credit card numbers into a web page somewhere, or as a launch pad for links to illegal activities and things like that. It's not just about the data; it's about your website being repurposed for stuff, right?
Yeah, I mean, look at I know there's one site out there, Pastebin, which I've used a few times to just post a code snippet or something before I found out about GitHub Gist. And if you look on there, there's just exploits of people getting doxxed or personal information or leaked email addresses from hacked websites. It's crazy, and I think it's their responsibility to sanitize that data, even if obfuscate or do whatever they need to that data to where they're not participating in leaking that information, or at least take it down as soon as it's been flagged or identified.
Yeah, that's sort of the safe thing. Is there are, as I understand it, I could be wrong, but as I understand it, there are certain laws and stuff that you run afoul of if you start actively moderating the content of other people putting things on your website. So you just follow the DMCA stuff in most cases. And my only experience with that is at one time running a public code sharing website and having to deal with DMCA complaints. And that was what I was advised is don't monitor, just take them down when you hear about them. But again, that's, talk to your lawyer.
So what tools do we have then for identifying where some of these things could be? Because it seems like, and I know, I've had conversations on other podcasts about this, so I know some of them, but is there kind of a comprehensive list of the kinds of vulnerabilities that we're going to be dealing with on the web so that we can just mitigate them up front instead of dealing with them on the back end where it's like, oh crap, people are stealing passwords out of my app?
Yeah, and one of the gems that I use is called Brakeman, and that's for a static code analysis. It's going to run through my application and generate a report that's going to tell me what vulnerabilities it was able to catch. And it's not going to be able to catch all vulnerabilities, but it will catch a lot of the different kind of code vulnerabilities that you have, whether it's SQL injection or some just very bad practices along the way, like opening up file access to users and different stuff like that. So that's been a great tool in my tool belt that I use on every application that I deploy. It's a free application, but then they also do have a pro version, which I'm not too familiar with, but the free application has done very well, and there's absolutely no reason why you can't bake that into your normal routine with developing. So, and actually did a Drift and Ruby screencast on Brakeman not too long ago. So, be sure to check that out if you want to learn more about Brakeman. Another tool that I use quite a bit is OWASP Zap, and that's the Z attack proxy. And the idea behind that is you basically set up a proxy, you point your browser to this proxy address, and a proxy is basically just going to be a kind of like a man in the middle between your browser and the application, and it's going to be able to pick up a lot of different type of cross-site scripting issues or different kind of vulnerabilities that could come up. And that's another free tool that I use quite a bit, but not as often as Brakeman.
Yeah, we did an episode just so people know. If you want to get kind of an idea what Brakeman's about, the episode's a little bit old, but we did talk to Justin Collins, who's the developer behind Brakeman, on Ruby Rogues a year or so ago.
Sweet. Another one that I played around with, but I haven't used too much, is called Metasploit. And I think that one is a Ruby-based application, but I think that one kind of goes similar to OWASP, but I think Metasploit is a automated tool where it just kind of hammers the server and tries to find different kind of vulnerabilities. And I think OWASP has a similar tool in there as well.
Metasploit's a really useful tool, not just for checking your app, but for testing your actual server configuration and the network it's attached to. I encourage everyone to learn how to use it, but I also encourage you to maybe give your hosting provider a heads up that you're going to do some kinds of testing against the servers, because their trust and safety folks might come in and say, "Hey, that's a violation of our terms of services." So it helps to give them a heads up if you're doing that kind of testing.
Yeah, and another thing that I use quite a bit is Cloudflare. I think Cloudflare provides several different benefits, not only to security, but also to being your CDN for your static assets. But as far as the security goes, if you enable the Cloudflare proxy, then you inherently have a certain level of protection where your IP address of your host is being obfuscated. That's not to say someone couldn't reverse and actually get that, but I think it does add at least one small layer of protection there, as well as some other things that you're able to do within there. Some of the tools that they have for mitigating a DDoS and stuff like that, I think is very useful.
So if you were going to build an app from scratch, would you just start out with Brakeman and then just periodically use something like OWASP Zap or Metasploit to kind of check in on the security? Or are there other practices you would put into place?
Before I commit any code to the repository, I would always run Brakeman on it. There's ways that you can have Brakeman running in the background, so anytime you change a file, it'll run and it'll scan those files for any kind of vulnerabilities, and that's accomplished through guard Brakeman, and I'll post a link in the show notes for that. But it's a great way to make sure that you're always running the Brakeman as your files are changing, just so you don't accidentally introduce a vulnerability and then not find it until a actual exploit comes along.
And just for clarity's sake, last time I looked at Brakeman, it only worked on Rails. Is that still the case, or does it work on other Rack apps now?
That's a good question. I don't know. I primarily focus on Rails, so I haven't looked into its other offerings. But another thing that really can help mitigate security is uh, a code review. So if you do have the luxury of having multiple people working on your application, as things are being developed and pushed up to your code repository, to actually take the time. I know meetings and stuff are killer for developers, but I think it's our responsibility to take the time to review one another's code, not to criticize it and stuff, but just to make sure that we are working towards a common goal of a productive and secure application. So having your peers code review, and then also having a small group of people that are actually quality assurancing your application. Unit tests are only going to do so much, and RSpec is only going to do so much to actually test the business logic. But a lot of times we don't build into our test cases vulnerability checks. And while you could do something like that, I think that's going to start increasing the amount of time your test cases will run, and that would inherently slow productivity as well.
Yeah, that makes sense. I'm also curious about zero-day vulnerabilities. So I guess once they're discovered, they're not zero-day anymore. But as people discover things, I remember a while back there was a big vulnerability in Rails that basically boiled down to the way that it parsed YAML into objects. And so there was this, a lot of people were concerned about it. And then, eventually a patch came out for Rails and it all got fixed. But is there a way for people to stay on top of, vulnerabilities in Ruby or Rails or Sinatra or whatever else they're using? Hey there, this is Charles Max Wood, and I just wanted to talk to you really briefly about Freelance Remote Conf. I'm putting on a conference for people who want to go freelance or who are freelance, and bringing in some of the experts from the Freelancer Show to talk to you about how to find clients, how to collect money, how to build your business, how to specialize, and much, much more. So if you're thinking about going freelance, or you're already freelance and want to hear from the experts on how to go, become, or grow your freelancing business, then by all means come check us out at freelanceremoteconf.com. Sinatra or whatever else they're using.
Yeah, and zero-day attacks are very difficult because basically it's a exploit that's found like a day or two before the developer's awareness or their fix for the bug. So, luckily and usually those things aren't long-lived. But then you do have certain cases like the crap, what was it called? It was a few years ago now. The Heartbleed.
Yeah, Heartbleed.
I think it was. Gosh, I feel like I'm getting old now. Can't remember things. You had that vulnerability, and that caused a huge scare, across the NextSec world. And there was fixes for it that were put out fairly quickly, but the adoption rate of those fixes were really slow. So I think, to your point, it's our responsibility also to make sure that we are monitoring that the gems that we're using, the JavaScript libraries, our application version, our framework version, that we are keeping up to date either through a mailing list or something where we have visibility over the different gems and packages that we're using if a exploit has been found, and the ways to mitigate that exploit.
Yeah,
we always run into this conversation, right? This is sort of I think listeners might get tired of us hearing that, but if you use it in your application, you are ultimately responsible for it, right? You've got to keep up with the versions, keep up with the with any security stuff, like you're saying. But you also got a whole stack that's running on. You have your OS, your operating system version, and you have to walk that fine line between installing the latest version of the OS, keeping that up to date, and breaking your production environment. So it isn't always just a matter of, hey, let's just run the updates, because the updates that might fix a security vulnerability, they also may have some downsides. So it's all that balancing act. How do you manage all of that?
There, I haven't used any of the services, but there are some services that will actually monitor gems, and it'll find if any vulnerabilities exist in them. And I think that's just through reported, hey, this gem version that you're using is vulnerable, and you need to upgrade to at least this version. So that's one way to do it, but I think it is a very difficult because once your application grows, if it grows to a enterprise level, so you just have a huge code base, it's going to get more and more difficult. So one thing that you could do, and if you are a large enough company, you may consider doing something like this, is actually hire a third party. You can get third-party security companies that will actually do the code review, and they will also do penetration tests on your applications. I think those companies are fairly expensive, but if you are a large enough company or if you have the revenue generating, then it may be worth something to look into.
What about outside of Rails? Like I was saying, you've got a database that you're probably connecting to. Well, we just had the MongoDB issue with the big security problem there, where it was just open for everyone to just come in and do stuff, and a lot of people lost data that way. The server, the OS they're running on, the web server that you're using, that you're putting in front of it, the load balancer you're putting in front of it, are there ways that we can that we can test those kinds of things too in an automated fashion that you're aware of?
I think Metasploit and OWASP will do that to a degree. They will check to make sure that certain things aren't accessible. But I think that as far as like your database being accessible, OWASP and Metasploit, I don't think they would necessarily catch something like that. They're just going to see really from the entry point that you give it, whether it's your application or a directory or something. I think that it's going to just start at that point, and I don't know if it would actually dig down deep into like the database level. So if you're using something like AWS for your hosting, I've talked with some of the guys over there about some of the networking side of things, and whatever ISP or host that you're going to use, leverage their knowledge as well on the best practices to configure the network, the database, different kind of access policies and stuff between your application, the database, and other services.
Right. You don't want to have like your Postgres database on one network and your application in another network, and you're just sending the queries. You've authenticated everybody to your Rails application in a secure fashion, but then you're just sending the queries over the open air, unsecured networks, right?
Yeah, you can actually have multiple different subnets and networks, but as long as they're kind of all localized, then it shouldn't be too big of a deal. Mm-hmm. But if you're just transporting over the internet, making a round trip, yeah, that would definitely be a risk in my mind.
Yeah, I bring that up because I just recently saw that, but that was happening. There was a cloud database provider that this application I was working on was using, and that's what was happening. Was like we can literally see the queries and the results coming across here.
Oh wow,
that's not. You probably don't want to do that. It's like there was a secure way to set it up. It's just they didn't do it because they didn't know. And that's the thing that worries me about a lot of this, is that a lot of it isn't like, it's not developers being lazy. It's that there's so many components to this. It's very easy to say, well, my code is secure. And when I'm using the Rails defaults, because I got the SQL injection handled, and I never disabled the sanitization of the HTML. I've got the cross-site request forgery everywhere. I've taken all those steps, and then all of a sudden, oh yeah, the connection that the app uses to the database servers on another platform is just wide open. you didn't know. There's so many of those facets. That's kind of what I find myself struggling with, is that there's an awful lot to know about with when it comes to the security stuff. It's just a lot of, just like everything else with the application development. The application development is getting more and more complex, and there's more things you have to be aware of. It helps now. If you're an application developer, it helps now to have a little understanding of networking and the network stack and firewall rules and stuff like that.
Yeah, absolutely. And if you look at it as a whole, just a picture as a whole, it is overwhelming. I mean, there are just so many different aspects. Each step along the way, there are just so many different potential vulnerabilities you could open up, or even just, setting up a new web application server. You run the risk of not locking down the ports that the server is listening on, taking the necessary security routes for managing the users, make sure that you don't just allow a root access with the password, that you're implementing any kind of SSH with either port knocking or also using certificates to verify the identity and authorization. So, I mean, there's just so much that goes into it that, I probably just know the tip of the iceberg of it, because NetSec is definitely not my background, but it's something that I am passionate about, because I don't want to put out something on the internet just to have it exploited and then taken advantage of.
No.
Yep. A few other resources I wanted to mention were that I've used in the past are one is there's the Rail Security mailing list. And it's not very active unless there's actually something to, to talk about or to worry about. So that's kind of an interesting one. So I think the last post I saw on there was like, I'm trying to remember, it was like in August or something of last year. But when there is something, they post there. And so that's a good place to look. And then they're also looking at updating the OWASP Top 10, which is the top 10 vulnerabilities for websites. And so this year they should come out with a new list. And so that should be interesting to see as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Jinx. No. So I think another thing that we also have to consider that could open up the vulnerability is something like what GitLab just experienced on their hosted environment, where they had a employee accidentally do something which resulted in the loss of production data for several hours of production data, and it took their some of their services down for a period of time. So I think that whether it's a rake task that you have that you are doing to initially provision your environment, that you put the necessary checks that this is not getting ran in production. Because I think rake DB drop will basically destroy your database. And I don't know if you can run that in production or not. If the environment's set to production, I don't know if there's any inherent safeguards. So we have to be careful that we're locking down rake tasks or other things that could be destroying production data.
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
Yeah.
So you mentioned the GitLab data loss incident, and if there's a link for like some postmortem or something, that would be cool to put in the show notes. Are there other incidences where people have actually, basically bad stuff happened? I mean, they're kind of the infamous big ones like Adobe and stuff, but are there more recent ones in Ruby or Rails applications that we know about?
I don't know of any recent Rails ones. I know like the Yahoo hack and all of that drama that came along with it. And then Target and I think Home Depot as well. They had some issues, but I think a lot of it is, vulnerabilities and security breaches are going to happen. I think, it's not a matter of if it's going to happen, it's a matter of when it's going to happen. And I think how we respond to those and what kind of checks we have in place to be identified when a breach is occurring or something like that, is also really important. And just how the whole situation is handled. I think the transparency that GitLab had with their incident was very admirable. I mean, they basically had a live session streaming of some of the GitLab people trying to work through and fix the issue. I think any company would have been embarrassed by that kind of approach, but their transparency and stuff just really gave me a lot of faith in their company that, look, they are taking this serious, even though it was internally caused. They are taking the issue very seriously. They're being very transparent about it. I know you can't always do that with companies, especially if you're in a financial world. You can't necessarily be as transparent just because the potential liability of further leaking information. But, I think that what they did in their case, it worked, and I think it worked really well.
Yeah, I agree.
Sure.
Are there other appropriate responses? I mean, I haven't looked to see what they did in particular, but if you're leaking data or something like that, I mean, should you shut your system down? Maybe move it to a new server? I remember having a security conversation a few years ago. I think it was with Patrick McKenzie, and that was what he recommended. I mean, is that still kind of the best practice, or is there some other way to, I don't know, catch the people who are doing it or track down where the issue is?
I'll leave that for the professionals to decide. No, it really depends on what kind of data is actually getting leaked. Any data leak is bad. Hands down, not a desirable thing. But I think it also matters what kind of industry you're in. If you have credit cards and other financial data within your data set, then you may want to look at just putting an immediate halt on all the transactions, just to make sure that you're not leaking out, very personal data. But if you're running a site like Reddit or something where, maybe there is a lot of value in those kind of sites, but, I think that if they had a leak of information or something, I don't know if it would be as catastrophic. Maybe usernames and passwords and email addresses, just because of the potential vulnerability to other websites that they could cause. But I don't know if I would take all of Reddit down just because, someone is leaking some information. I would just try to put mitigations in place for that.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, I kind of err on the side of being the overcautious. Okay, we're going to shut this down. We're going to isolate it. We're going to spin another instance up, and then we can kind of do the forensic work of trying to figure out how they got in and what they're doing.
Yeah.
Well, one thing that you can do to try and stay secure is to not treat your servers like pets. I've seen that way too often, and I've been victim of it too. But your application servers specifically, they're not pets. You should not give them a name. You should not hold them, let them into your house. They should just be very disposable cattle. And the idea behind that is, one, for deploying new environments is going to be very quick if you're able to quickly run some automated scripts, either through Ansible or whatever other kind of automation software you're using to spin up new application servers. It's going to give you the benefit of being able to attach it to some kind of auto scale group. So as your application increases in traffic, it's going to be able to increase the load it can handle. But then it's also not going to allow for a lot of these residual files to just kind of stick around on your system for years and years. Mm-hmm. Whatever your policy is, if you spin up new instances every week or every day or every release, instead of doing, an app update, app upgrade, or whatever Linux distro you're using, then you don't have to worry about that. You provision a new server. It's all up to date with all the security vulnerabilities. It has the latest code base, and now it's added into your load balancer pool. So I think we all fall into the habit of treating our computers or our servers like pets. like my desktop, that is my pet. That's my baby, one of my babies. So, I do treat that one and I maintain it and stuff. But my other servers and stuff that I have a golden image on each one of those that is updated periodically. And that's the image I use if I need to spin up additional servers, or if I make, if I decide to just rotate everything.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree. If you hadn't mentioned that, I was gonna chime in with that, because that's what I've been doing recently is just, and I do that as part of my deploy process. Like when I'm going to deploy a new version of the app, one of the things I do is I make sure that my entire deployment process works. I use the scripts to spin up a new machine, provision it, and put the application out there. And once I'm sure that the application is working on that new machine, I swap out the old one. I take the old one out.
It's going down.
Well, that way I know that in an emergency, like if I spent the time to build this all up, right, and then nothing happens, nothing goes wrong, everything's just fine, and I go 6 months without running the script to provision an entirely new environment, well, and then I can't guarantee that it works. But if I've been running it frequently, just sort of like backups and restores, right? If you don't periodically test your backups and your restore process, you can't really feel confident that you can rely on it when something real bad happens.
Yep.
And I've had that happen where I've had this awesome script to go and provision a server, and then when I actually need to go use it, there's some library that's out of date, or something that's changed, or the API that I'm calling against for my hosting provider has changed somehow, and now I have to rewrite part of the script. So going through that process periodically as part of regular deployment helps me identify those things as I go.
Yeah, and if you are going to do something like that for every update, so anytime you want to deploy some new code, you could do something like that where you're basically provisioning all new servers with the latest code base and then expiring the old ones. But you have to also kind of, because then that kind of introduces a performance issue where if you have to run bundle on a gem file that has thousands of gems, to make sure that you're not causing unnecessary delays in spinning up the new instances, especially if you're trying to deliver a hotfix or something that is addressing a major security vulnerability. You want to get that thing out sooner than later.
Sure.
So, I think with something like that, you want to make sure that, and this kind of running off topic, but you want to make sure that on production servers, you're not installing the RDoc file. So in your GemRC, you have a line where you're basically telling your bundle to not install any kind of docs, because that can take quite a while in itself. Yeah. If you have a local proxy, or even if you just run I think it's like a bundle install deployment, to where it actually puts all the gems installed into your vendor folder.
Yeah.
Then once you deploy it.
I was gonna say that's how I keep deployments fast. Is I've taken to just it's just shrink wrapping the gems basically, and just putting the vendor cache.
Yeah, and you can also use something like I think it's Code Climate to precompile all your assets prior to even getting to that deployment stage, and that could also help reduce some of the downtime for each server that you're provisioning.
Yep. Well, I'm going to take the opportunity. You talked a lot about deployment, cattle not pets, and I heard a lot about that at DevOps Remote Conf. So I'm going to just kind of plug that for a second. If you're looking for information, there was a lot of talk about Docker and about some of the other systems that you use to automate a lot of this stuff. And so if you're looking to dig into that, you really want to learn about it, the talks are available for that conference. You just buy an after-the-fact ticket for $100 and you're in. So is there anything else that we should be going into with the security? Any other aspects of this that we haven't talked about yet? How do you stop a DDoS attack? I'm kind of curious what you say about that. You just write it out? Use Cloudflare?
You just pay the Bitcoins. I think that's the standard protocol, right? No, sorry. The Cloudflare, they do have a button that you can press. Are you under a DDoS attack or something like that? I have no idea what that button does. I really want to press it someday. So, I guess it probably adds some kind of authentication, or that I'm not a robot kind of captcha to the site. It kind of injects that in there. That's what I would assume it does. So it reduces the number of potential hits per second that you're getting. But I really don't know too much about the networking and side of things to actually do some lower level mitigation. I would just use something like Cloudflare to mitigate the DDoS.
Yep. Hey everybody, this is Charles Max Wood. I just wanted to talk to you really briefly about JS Remote Conf. We just picked speakers. Things are looking really good, and we're really excited to cover a broad range of topics for JavaScript developers. So if you're looking to learn things about Node.js, about becoming a better developer, about deployment, about mobile development, and much more about JavaScript, then come check us out, jsremoteconf.com. You can also find it by going to devchat.tv/conferences and then picking the conference you want. We have last year's recordings there. We have this year's conference coming up, so make sure you get your ticket, and we'll see you there. Yep.
Right on.
All right, well, let's go ahead and do some picks. Brian, do you want to start us off with picks?
Yeah, I only have one pick. There's a website that I love to read. It's related to security. It's called privacyrights.org. And they have a section called data breaches, where they are just they're collecting this large, massive list of data breaches around the country, and you can actually search for it. You can download the data as a CSV file, which is kind of fun. But you can see like state government agencies that have been hacked and how they've been hacked, corporations that have reported the hacks, and you can see what kinds of things have happened. It's good for consumers because you can find out, oh yeah, it looks like the DMV here in our county just leaked a whole bunch of social security numbers. That's great, but it's also good if you're thinking about security of what kinds of things should I be thinking about. You can just kind of read through, go, oh, these folks have been hacked, and people got away with social security numbers. Do I use social security numbers in my application? Why do I use social security numbers in my application? But there's also an RSS feed that you can subscribe to get new breaches on the list. I love this resource a lot.
Nice. Dave, what are your picks?
I guess my pick is a screencast I did on Adder Accessor, which is basically a way where you can encrypt individual attributes within your Rails application. And basically, so if your database is ever stolen, then you have the same level of protection that you do with a bcrypt password on your actual attributes. So if you do have something like a social security number within your database and that database gets leaked, at least your socials are stored as a bcrypt, and this could be much more difficult to attack. And with bcrypt being a fairly strong encryptor, then it may just not be worth to actually try and get that data. So,
all right. I'm going to jump in here with a pick that is not related to this at all. Well, I'll pick one, and that is that we talked to a security expert on JavaScript Jabber a few weeks ago. His name is Kim Carter. I'll put a link to the episode with Kim Carter in the show notes. But basically, we talked a lot about web security and went into a lot of the stuff there as well. So if you're looking at that, kind of from a little bit more front end kind of thing, and he recommended a lot of the same things that Dave mentioned. So definitely good stuff there. And then the other thing that I'm gonna what?
Oh, sorry, Charles. I was gonna say it's not Adder Accessor. I was looking at some code when I was talking, and Adder Accessor was written right in front of my face. It's Adder Encrypted.
Oh, cool. Okay.
Sorry about that.
I typed it into the show notes, and I think, I think we got it correct there. All right. So the other thing I'm going to pick, and this is a book that my business coach recommended to me yesterday, and I've read about half of it. And the reason I didn't finish it because it's a short read was because there are videos associated with it. It's called The Invisible Sales Machine by Ryan Deiss, and it's got a ton of great stuff in it. So if you're looking at kind of building things up to to do sales or things like that. So for example, I'm doing the conferences and stuff like that. Then definitely check it out. It is awesome. And check out the videos too, because they are amazing. And that's all I really have to say about that. So yeah, we'll go ahead and wrap this one up. Thank you both for being here. And we will be on next week.
Yeah, thanks for having me again.
Always a pleasure.
Bandwidth for this segment is provided by CacheFly, the world's fastest CDN. Deliver your content fast with CacheFly. Visit CACHEFLY.com to learn more.